Today I'm going to continue my series that I entitled Universal Truth That Jesus Taught. The reason I embarked on this series was one of the things that really scares me is this Christian nationalism. And what scares me is what they teach and what they say Jesus taught and what Christianity is. And I want to rebuke that based on what Jesus actually taught, but take that a step further. And my first step is always compare it to the Buddha. I recommend there's a great book out there written by Marcus Borg, simply called Jesus and Buddha, where all it is, whatever page you turn to, on the left side is a saying of Jesus, and on the right side is the parallel saying of the Buddha. And then I take that a step further, and I look at Judaism, Islam, and Hindu, which those are the five major world religions. And if all five teach the same thing, then I believe it's a universal truth. Because the universal truth transcends any one religion or any one belief system. And the fact that these major belief systems embrace these ideas, for me, just reinforces. And today what I want to talk about is this idea of retribution. We're hearing that a lot now. That retribution belongs to God. However, I am your retribution. I guess you know who said that. Where an individual decides that they are an instrument of God and therefore have the right to retaliate, to seek revenge, to be retribution on those that they think are their enemies. And the extreme that this is being taken to by Christian nationalists. There was a Christian minister, evangelical, who in a talk said, we need to take homosexuals and line them up against a wall and shoot them. Christian, claimed to be a Christian, to retaliate and create retribution against those that we deem are wrong. That's what always upsets me when I hear things like that. Because I go, that is not the Jesus that I've come to know. And I don't find those teachings anywhere in what Jesus taught. So on the idea of retribution, I have to begin with the famous quote, as Jesus did. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We hear this phrase uttered by so many people as a justification to do what they're doing. And I'm going to get a little more into that in a little bit when I talk about Judaism, because that's where it comes from. It's from the book of Leviticus. So Jesus said, you have heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, offer no resistance to one who is evil. When someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other one to him as well. So Jesus is saying, no retribution. We don't do that because retribution leads to retribution. And the image there is, if somebody gets your right cheek, because most people are right-handed, for somebody facing you to strike your right cheek, they have to do it backhanded. which at Jesus' time, that was the ultimate insult. So you didn't have to do it hard. It was just kind of almost like you see people with the gloves and I'm going to duel you. It's the ultimate insult, and Jesus saying, don't respond to that. Turn and let them have your other cheek. That was preached by a minister one time in his church a short time ago, and he was all upset when people came up to him and said, why all of a sudden are you teaching these woke ideas in our church? And the minister told them, well, this is exactly what Jesus taught. And their response was, well, those teachings aren't for our time. Yeah, it's a contradiction. We follow Jesus, but he didn't mean that for us today. In the Gospel of Luke, we see it, but I say to you, listen, which to me is an emphasis there. Jesus said, listen to this. This is important. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. And in Paul's letter to the Romans, which explain a little bit, it's the first book after the Acts of the Apostles, the first of Paul's letters. So many people think, oh, that's the first one he wrote. No. The letters of Paul, the order they were put in is based on the size of the letter. Romans was his last letter. And unlike the other letters he wrote, all the other letters were written to churches that either he started or he had visited already. He had never been to Rome at this point, and he wrote the letter to the Romans to introduce himself to the church in Rome. So many scholars believe what we have in Romans is Paul's summary of what he believes. And he wrote in Romans, if your enemy are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing so, this will heap burning coals on their heads. That last line is based in the book of Proverbs. Basically, what it says is the meaner and nastier, or the more someone else disagrees with you, the nicer you become. The more they hate you, the more love you show towards them. I've shared this story before, but I've done this in the past. I do this. If someone is being mean and nasty to me, I'd be nice to them in return. And I'll give an example. Years ago, when I worked at a place, there was a woman there who, the best way to describe her, if you heard the term psychic vampire, someone who feeds on the energy of someone else. And she fed on chaos and just getting people upset and even crying. Because I could see she'd get somebody crying, and you could see she got energized and even smiled. And so she came after me a lot too and trying to get me angry, and I just decided, the meaner she gets to me, the nicer I'm going to get to her. And I started treating her nicely. I even gave her a Christmas present and things like this. And all of a sudden, she stopped bothering me. And other people noticed it and say, how did you get her to stop? And I told them, and most went, oh, I can't do that. One of my staff said, I'm going to try that. And she began to leave her alone too. Because she couldn't handle somebody she's attacking, being angry at, all of a sudden being nice to them. That's the hot coals that Proverbs talks about, that Paul is quoting here. This is what Jesus taught. Nothing in that talks about retribution or revenge. It just totally goes against what Jesus actually taught. The Buddha taught, hatreds do not ever cease in the world by hating, but by love. Overcome evil by good. So right away we see that parallel between what Jesus taught and what the Buddha taught. According to Buddhism, retribution is a form of violence that contradicts basic ethics. Committing violence against the offender does not wipe away the suffering caused by a crime, nor does it encourage the criminal to accept responsibility for their actions in order to act better in the future. And then Buddhism goes on to say, hatred, greed, and delusion are considered the three kleshas, or psychological poisons. So hatred, and hatred that leads to retribution or leads to revenge, is a poison to that individual. It poisons their view of the world. It poisons how they treat others. So right away we see that parallel between Jesus and the Buddha. Now, when I researched this talk, I knew that those two would parallel very easily, because Buddhism and Christianity really teach the same thing in different ways. And I said, okay, now I've got to look at Judaism. And that's where the phrase out of the book of out of the book of Exodus comes the phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So I delved into Jewish teachings on this. And what the rabbis taught, eye for an eye implies that he who plucks out the eye of his fellow shall give something to the victim that will come in place of that eye, which can no longer perform its functions. And that is monetary compensation. Earliest versions of lawsuits. That if you pluck out somebody's eye, then you have to pay them or give them land or something to make up for taking that person's eye. The rabbis taught, if they take your eye, then who gains anything? They don't have an eye, you don't have an eye, and there's no compensation. Because in the book of Leviticus, which before I read this, the book of Leviticus is nothing but a list of laws. And this is the book that Christian nationalists quote when they're condemning homosexuality. The only place in both either the Hebrew scriptures or Old Testament or the Christian scriptures, the New Testament, that we have a law about homosexuality is in Leviticus, where it says, a man shall not lay with a man as he would with a woman. But Leviticus is also the book that says, if your daughter defiles herself before marriage, then the father must stone her. If a man shaves his beard, he needs to be beheaded. You don't see these being quoted. Along with this one, which is also in the book of Leviticus. You shall not take revenge. So if you're going to quote a book, quote everything. And then in the Talmud, what the Talmud is, it's a companion book to the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it's stories that elaborate on what is being taught in the Torah. And this comes from the Talmud. What is revenge? Taking revenge is when you ask someone, lend me your sickle, and he says no. The next day he comes to you and asks you, lend me your hatchet. You respond, I am not lending to you just like you did not lend to me. This is an example of revenge. So if they saw revenge as something that simple, the Talmud is teaching, then don't go even beyond that. That we do not commit revenge or retribution. I think Mahatma Gandhi put it very well when he says, if everyone did an eye for an eye, then the whole world would be blind. And even the Jewish teachings where this phrase comes from, they're saying it's not a literal, you don't take somebody's eye because they took your eye. You don't punch them because they punched you. This is a very hard path to follow. What Jesus and the Buddha and these teachings are setting up is a high ideal that we need to strive for. Things like revenge, retribution, and hatred is what keeps us from achieving these higher goals. Now, I really thought I'd have trouble with Islam. But as I delved deeper, I realized, wait a minute, yes. In Judaism and in a lot in that Middle East area, there's a lot of that attitude of, I can kill you based on what your grandfather did to my grandfather. We see that in the feuds we talk about in this country that have happened, like the Hatfields and the McCoys. And what happens with this is retribution. We also see that in mobster movies, where one gang kills people, then they kill more, and it just escalates and keeps continuing. And that is what the Quran is teaching, that we don't do that. You don't want to escalate it. You want to end it, because it's just going to get out of hand. It says in the Quran, surely Allah forgives all sins. Indeed, He is the most forgiving, the merciful. We then learn, and the recompense of evil is punishment like it, but whoever forgives and amends, he shall have the rewards of Allah. So the first step is to forgive, to make amends with someone. When you forgive others for the sake of the Almighty, the rewards that come back to you will be greater than anything you've lost due to someone having wronged you or hurt you. So the rewards of forgiveness are greater than extracting revenge or retribution. Remember your successes with Him, not His creation. And I love this added line. And don't worry about what people think. Because people may call you weak. They'll call you whatever if you forgive someone instead of seeking retribution. And the Quran is telling us, don't worry about it. forgive, end it, no retribution, no hatred, to love everyone. What a radical idea. You know, I truly believe that if Jesus came today, right away he would be labeled woke. Because this is what woke is about. It's not about the definitions. You heard one yesterday. Somebody who's woke is against everything in the establishment. Okay, no. Love the fact they can't define it. Woke to me is being awakened to the light of love. For those who haven't heard, the first time the word woke was used was in the late 50s. And someone was declared woke when they accepted the fact that there's systemic racism in this country. That's the original meaning of the word woke. And if you're living a life of love, that's one of the things you're going to see. That things aren't fair. That there is issues with this and other things. So Jesus would not be well accepted these days by those who claim to be Christian nationalists and who display pictures of Jesus holding an AR-15. Just look it up. You'll see him. That's not what Yashu taught. Jesus. And finally, in Hinduism, we see the same thing. When we are wronged by someone and retaliate in ways that violate rightful conduct, it is called revenge. When we respond through good conduct and legal processes, it is called justice. Justice is Dharma, regarded in Hinduism as a cosmic law underlying right behavior and social order, while revenge is adhamma, that which is not in accord with the Dharma. So even in Hinduism, don't seek revenge. Revenge just leads to revenge. Retribution just leads to retribution. Hatred simply leads to more hatred. That we are called to love. What Christian nationalism is teaching is fear, the opposite of love. To fear those who are different from us. To fear those who disagree with us, and of course fear leads into anger. Where Jesus, the Buddha, we even see in Judaism, Islam, and Hinduism, they don't teach hatred. They're teaching end it. Stop the retribution. Stop the retaliation. Therefore, I've come to believe that love and forgiveness against hatred and retribution, that love and forgiveness is a universal truth. One that all of us should strive for in our lives. And don't worry about what someone else may think. Because as I read, if you forgive someone, the person you're really freeing is yourself. You're not locking yourself into that hatred, that fear, that anger. You're releasing it. I've seen great examples of that at the end of murder trials, or in the murder trial when the family gets to say something before sentencing. And two things we see. One, families go, yes, they need to die. They need the death penalty. That will make me feel better. And they've done research with those families after the person was executed. And and they don't feel any better. The other example is the families, and many of them from the stand said, I forgive you. And the research shows that they move on. They can be at peace. They're no longer holding that hatred for that person. To me, that is just a prime example of what we're talking about, where you don't look for revenge or retribution. You go for forgiveness and for love. Amen. Blessed be. Namaste.